At 0700, on January 24, 1945, First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Connor stood in the frozen command post of 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, watching German artillery shells destroy the tree line 400 yards to his front. 25 years old, intelligence officer, recently returned from the hospital with wounds still healing. The German 19th Army had massed 600 infantry troops and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks for a counterattack designed to break through the American positions near House in France. At 0700, on January 24, 1945, First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Connor stood in the frozen command post of 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, watching German artillery shells destroy the tree line 400 yards to his front. 25 years old, intelligence officer, recently returned from the hospital with wounds still healing. The German 19th Army had massed 600 infantry troops and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks for a counterattack designed to break through the American positions near House in France. Connor was 5'6", 120 pounds, a tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky. He had never finished high school. The nearest school had been 15 miles from his family's farm. He had enlisted in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. 4 years of war, 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious assault landings, wounded 7 times. The last wound had sent him to the hospital 3 weeks ago. He had returned to his battalion 2 days earlier against medical advice. In the next 3 hours, Connor would make a decision that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He would run 400 yards through German artillery fire, carrying nothing but a telephone and a spool of wire. He would crawl into a shallow ditch 30 yards ahead of the American line with 600 German soldiers and 6 Tiger tanks advancing directly toward him. And when the Germans got so close that artillery could no longer save the battalion without killing him first, he would give an order that has echoed through military history for 8 decades. Fire on my position. This is the story of how one Kentucky tobacco farmer saved his entire battalion by calling American artillery down on himself. How he survived 3 hours in a ditch that provided no protection. How he stopped 6 Tiger tanks with nothing but a telephone. And how he spent 50 years hiding the medals in a cardboard box because talking about it felt like bragging. 3rd Battalion held a section of the front line north of the Colmar Pocket. The Colmar Pocket was the last German-held territory in France, 850 square miles of frozen forest and farm fields west of the Rhine River. The Germans had held it since November. Every attempt to eliminate the pocket had failed. The French First Army had lost thousands of men trying to push the Germans back across the Rhine. Operation Nordwind had started on New Year's Day, the last major German offensive in the West. While the Battle of the Bulge still raged 300 miles north, Hitler had ordered Army Group G to break through American lines in Alsace. The offensive had failed, but the Germans in the Colmar Pocket remained. And they were desperate. 3rd Battalion had been on the line for 18 days. Temperatures averaged 10 degrees below zero. No moonlight. Snow covered everything. Soldiers slept in frozen foxholes when they could sleep at all. German patrols probed the American positions every night. The battalion had lost 43 men in 2 weeks, mostly to artillery and sniper fire. Connor worked in the battalion command post. An intelligence officer gathered information about enemy movements, interrogated prisoners, analyzed patrol reports, marked German positions on maps. It was not a combat role. Intelligence officers stayed behind the front line. They worked with maps and reports. They did not lead attacks, but Connor had not stayed behind the lines during 4 years of war. He had earned 4 Silver Stars for direct combat action. October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, September 1944 in France, December 1944 in Alsace. Each silver star represented an action where Connor had risked his life to save other soldiers. He had a reputation in 3rd Battalion. When the situation turned desperate, Connor moved forward. Garlin Murl Connor was born August 2, 1920 in Clinton County, Kentucky. The farm sat on Indian Creek, miles from the nearest town. No electricity, no running water. The family worked tobacco and corn using mules and horses, the same methods their grandparents had used. Connor's father died when Garland was 12. The farm fell to Garland and his brothers. School became impossible. The nearest high school was 15 miles away. Getting there required walking or riding a horse. In winter, the roads were impassable. Connor attended sporadically, finally quit at 15 to work full-time. He was small, 5'6", maybe 125 pounds soaking wet. But he could work 14 hours in tobacco fields without complaint, could lift bales that men twice his size struggled with. The farm taught him endurance. It taught him that complaining accomplished nothing. It taught him to finish what he started regardless of how hard it got. In March 1941, Connor enlisted in the Army. The farm wasn't producing enough to support the family. The military offered steady pay, $21 a month, more money than tobacco farming provided. The recruiter in Albany looked at Connor's application. "You never finished high school?" "No, sir." "Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Can you follow orders?" "Yes, sir." "That's good enough. Raise your right hand." Connor shipped to basic training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia. The other recruits were bigger, better educated, came from cities where they'd learned to navigate bureaucracy. Connor knew tobacco and horses. He'd never seen a military installation, never fired a rifle at anything except rabbits, but he could march all day without falling out, could do whatever the drill sergeants demanded without complaint. By the time basic training ended, the sergeants had noticed. This quiet Kentucky farm boy never quit, never complained, never gave up. They made him a squad leader. Connor deployed to North Africa in December 1942 with the 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. The division landed at Fadala, French Morocco, during Operation Torch. Connor saw his first combat at Casablanca, small arms fire from Vichy French positions. He led his squad through it, returned fire, accomplished the mission. The 3rd Infantry Division fought across North Africa through early 1943. Tunisia, the Kasserine Pass. Connor earned his first promotion to sergeant. His squad had the lowest casualty rate in the company, not because they avoided combat, because Connor moved them smart, kept them alive, finished every mission. July 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Connor's regiment landed at Licata. Heavy resistance on the beaches, German and Italian forces firing from concrete pillboxes. Connor led his squad through machine gun fire, cleared 3 pillboxes, secured the beach exit. He earned his first Silver Star. The citation mentioned his leadership under fire, his personal courage, his willingness to risk his life to save others. Connor put the medal in his duffel bag and didn't mention it. September 1943. The invasion of mainland Italy at Salerno. The 3rd Infantry Division hit the beaches in the second wave. German counterattacks nearly drove them back into the sea. Connor's company held a section of the line that absorbed repeated assaults. On September 15th, a German tank-supported attack overran the American positions to Connor's left. The breakthrough threatened to roll up the entire beachhead. Connor gathered 12 men, led a counterattack against superior forces, retook the lost position, held it for 6 hours against repeated German attempts to break through. 2nd Silver Star. He was promoted to staff sergeant, then to technical sergeant. His company commander recommended him for officer candidate school. Connor refused. "I'm not officer material," he said. "I didn't finish high school." The commander submitted the paperwork anyway. Connor shipped to OCS in November 1943. He graduated in February 1944 as a second lieutenant. The Army assigned him back to 3rd Infantry Division as an intelligence officer. January 1944. Anzio. The amphibious landing went smoothly. The Germans counterattacked for weeks. Connor's battalion held positions northeast of Anzio town. The fighting was brutal, close range, often hand-to-hand. German artillery pounded the American positions constantly. On January 30th, Connor's forward observation post took a direct hit. All 4 soldiers were killed. German infantry attacked through the gap. Connor left the command post, ran forward under artillery fire, rallied the survivors, organized a defense that stopped the German advance. 3rd Silver Star. He was wounded for the first time. Shrapnel from an 88mm shell tore through his left arm and shoulder. He refused evacuation until the position was secure. Spent 3 days in the hospital, returned to duty against medical advice. The pattern repeated through 1944. Connor in combat, Connor wounded, Connor refusing to stay down. The 3rd Infantry Division fought up the Italian peninsula. Rome fell in June. Connor was there. Southern France in August. Operation Dragoon. Connor hit the beaches at Saint-Tropez, earned his 4th Silver Star for actions near Montélimar. By December 1944, Connor had been wounded 6 times. Purple Hearts accumulated in his duffel bag. He never wore them. When soldiers asked about the scars, he said he'd been careless. Now, January 24, 1945, Connor stood in the command post watching German artillery destroy his battalion's positions. The barrage had started at 0700. It was now 7:15. The shells were walking across the American foxholes methodically, professionally. The Germans knew what they were doing. At 07:15, the barrage intensified. Shells walked across the battalion's forward positions. Trees exploded. Dirt and frozen earth fountained into the air. The barrage lasted 12 minutes. Then it stopped. Silence. Then the sound of tank engines. A runner burst into the command post, gasping for breath. Germans advancing, 6 Tigers, infantry behind them. Hundreds of infantry moving through the woods toward the battalion's left flank. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Keith Ware, looked at the map. If the Tigers reached the American positions, they would roll through the foxholes. The battalion would be overrun. There were no American tanks in position to stop them. No tank destroyers. The only weapon that could stop 6 Tigers was artillery. But artillery needed a forward observer. Someone who could see the Germans advancing, someone who could adjust the fire. The forward observation post had been destroyed by the barrage. The observers were dead or wounded. No one could see the German advance from the command post. The trees blocked the view. If artillery fired blind, the shells might hit American positions, might kill American soldiers. The risk was too high. Ware looked at his officers. "We need someone forward, someone who can see the Germans and direct fire." Connor studied the map. The German advance was coming through a section of woods 400 yards from the command post. To observe the attack, someone would have to run 400 yards across open ground under German artillery fire, then stay in position ahead of the American line, while 6 Tiger tanks and 600 German infantry advanced directly toward them. Connor picked up a telephone and 400 yards of wire. He looked at Ware. Then he walked out of the command post into the snow. The German artillery barrage had stopped, but Connor knew it would resume. The Germans always fired preparation barrages before tank attacks. They would wait for their infantry to get closer, then the guns would open up again to pin down the defenders while the Tigers rolled forward. Connor ran. 400 yards of open ground between the command post and the front line. Snow covering frozen earth. The telephone wire unspooled behind him. He carried the spool in his left hand, the telephone handset in his right. His boots broke through the snow crust with each step. At 100 yards, the German guns opened fire. Shells landed 40 yards to his left, then 30 yards to his right. The Germans were adjusting. They had observers watching the open ground. They could see a lone American soldier running toward their attack. A shell hit a tree 70 yards ahead. The tree exploded. Splinters and branches and frozen wood fragments showered down. Connor kept running. Another shell landed 20 yards behind him. The concussion wave hit him like a fist. He stumbled but did not fall. The wire kept unspooling. At 250 yards, a shell destroyed a tree directly in his path. The trunk split down the middle. Half the tree crashed down across the snow. Connor vaulted over the trunk without stopping. Shrapnel had torn through the branches. Pieces of hot metal hissed in the snow. Another shell, this one closer. 15 yards to his left. Frozen earth and snow geysered up. Chunks of dirt rained down on him. The blast wave hammered his eardrums. He could not hear his own breathing anymore, just a high-pitched ringing. He reached the American front line at 300 yards. Soldiers crouched in foxholes. They stared at him. An intelligence officer running toward the German advance with a telephone. He did not stop to explain. He kept running forward toward the enemy. 30 yards beyond the American foxholes, Connor found what he needed. A shallow ditch maybe 18 inches deep. Not deep enough to stop bullets, not deep enough to protect against artillery, but deep enough to give him a sight line toward the German advance while keeping his silhouette below the snow level. He dropped into the ditch. The telephone wire had held. He cranked the handset. The connection buzzed. Then a voice. The Artillery Fire Direction Center, 3 miles behind the front line. American 105mm howitzers, 12 guns. Enough firepower to shatter a German attack if the shells landed in the right place. Connor gave his position. The fire direction officer confirmed. Connor was now the eyes of 3rd Battalion's artillery. Everything depended on what he could see and whether he could stay alive long enough to direct the guns. He raised his head above the ditch rim. The German infantry were 200 yards away, moving through the trees in squad formations, rifles at the ready. They advanced in short rushes. One squad would move while another provided covering fire. Professional soldiers, experienced. They knew how to attack through defended positions. Behind the infantry, the Tigers. Connor could see 4 of them, massive 60-ton monsters pushing through the smaller trees like they were saplings. The Tigers stayed in the tree line, using the forest for cover. But they were coming. Slow, methodical. They would break into the open ground in minutes. The German infantry had not seen him yet. He was alone, 30 yards ahead of the American line, in a ditch that provided almost no protection, with a telephone and 600 German soldiers walking directly toward him. Connor lifted the handset. He gave the coordinates. Fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open. Adjusting. The first shells landed 30 seconds later, 100 yards beyond the German positions. Connor adjusted. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The second salvo landed in the tree line. The explosions lit up the forest. Trees disintegrated. Shrapnel tore through the German formations. Connor watched soldiers fall, watched others dive for cover. But the Tigers kept coming. The 105mm shells couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. They might damage the tracks, might kill exposed crew members, but they wouldn't stop the tanks. The Tigers would break through unless something changed. Connor adjusted fire. He walked the shells across the German advance, targeting the infantry supporting the tanks. Without infantry protection, the Tigers would be vulnerable to American bazookas and rifle grenades. But the German infantry were well trained. They kept moving, used the terrain, maintained cohesion despite the artillery. At 0745, the Tigers broke from the tree line into open ground. Connor could see all 6 now. They formed a line, 50 yards between each tank, advancing at walking speed. The infantry followed in their wake, using the massive tanks for cover. The distance to Connor's position, 150 yards. He called for more fire. The shells fell around the Tigers, hitting the infantry, killing dozens. But the tanks rolled forward, 125 yards. The German artillery resumed. Shells began falling on the American foxholes. The soldiers couldn't return effective fire. They were pinned down. If the Tigers reached the foxholes, it would be over. Connor was the only thing stopping them. 100 yards. He could hear the tank engines now, the squeal of tracks on frozen ground, the clatter of 75-ton machines crushing everything in their path. 75 yards. The American soldiers in the foxholes began falling back. They had no weapons that could stop Tigers at this range. Their orders were to retreat if armor broke through, regroup, counterattack later. But Connor stayed in the ditch. He adjusted fire again, closer. The shells were falling 50 yards behind the Tigers now, still hitting the infantry, still killing Germans. But the tanks kept coming. 50 yards. Connor could see the German tank commanders now, heads visible in the turrets, scanning for targets. One pointed directly at his position. Had they seen him? A machine gun opened fire. German MG-42. The bullets tore through the snow, 10 yards to Connor's right. They'd spotted him. The machine gun fire walked toward his position. Connor pressed himself flat in the ditch. Bullets snapped overhead, impacted the frozen earth around him. He lifted the handset. 40 yards. The Tigers were close enough now that he could see the individual track links, could see the frost on the armor plating, could see the 88mm main guns traversing to target the American foxholes. The artillery fire direction officer's voice crackled through the handset. "We're hitting Germans, but the tanks are still advancing. Do you want us to shift fire?" Connor looked at the Tigers. 35 yards and closing. If the artillery shifted fire away from his position, the German infantry would break through behind the tanks. If the artillery stayed where it was, the tanks would reach the American line unopposed. There was only one option left. Connor gave the order that would define the rest of his life. "Fire on my position." Silence on the line. Then the fire direction officer's voice, uncertain. "Say again?" "Fire on my position. Danger close. All batteries." "Sir, I know what it will do." "Fire on my position, now." The artillery officer hesitated for 3 seconds. Then he gave the order to his gun crews. Connor had maybe 15 seconds before the first shells arrived. 15 seconds to get as flat as humanly possible in an 18-inch ditch. He dropped the handset, pressed himself into the frozen earth, covered his head with his arms. The Tigers were 30 yards away when the first shells landed. The 105mm howitzers fired high explosive rounds with variable time fuses. The shells were designed to detonate above ground, spraying shrapnel downward over a wide area, devastating against infantry, dangerous to friendly forces within 200 yards. Connor was 0 yards from the impact point. The first shells exploded directly overhead. The concussion wave was like being hit by a truck. Connor's body was pressed into the earth with impossible force. The sound was beyond hearing, beyond comprehension, a physical assault that turned the world into roaring chaos. Shrapnel screamed through the air. Hot metal fragments tore through the snow, through the trees, through everything. Some pieces were the size of baseballs, traveling at thousands of feet per second. They punched through tank armor like cardboard. The Tigers stopped advancing. One took a direct hit to the engine compartment. The explosion blew the rear deck plating off. Smoke poured from the engine. The tank sat motionless, disabled. Another Tiger's track was severed by shrapnel. The tank slewed sideways, one track churning while the other dragged uselessly. The German infantry supporting the tanks were caught in the open. The shells fell among them like hammers. Men died in groups, in clusters, entire squads wiped out in seconds. Connor lay in his ditch with shells exploding overhead, with the earth shaking, with death falling all around him. Shrapnel impacted the ground inches from his body. He felt the heat of the explosions, felt dirt and frozen earth cascading over him, felt the concussion waves trying to lift him from the ditch. He did not move, could not move. The only thing keeping him alive was that 18-inch depression in frozen ground. The barrage lasted 2 minutes, 120 seconds of continuous high-explosive hell landing on Connor's position. The 105mm howitzers fired for effect, all 12 guns, coordinated fire, everything the artillery could deliver. When the guns finally stopped, the silence was absolute. Connor lifted his head. The landscape had transformed. Trees were gone, shredded to stumps. The snow was black with dirt and debris. Craters pocked the ground. Smoke drifted across the battlefield. The Tigers were stopped. 3 disabled, tracks blown off, or engines destroyed. 2 had reversed back into the tree line, seeking cover. The 6th sat motionless, its crew either dead or abandoning the vehicle. The German infantry was shattered. Connor could see bodies scattered across the snow. The survivors were retreating, running back toward the German lines. The attack had broken. Connor picked up the handset. The line was dead. A shell fragment had severed the wire somewhere between his position and the command post. He was alone, 30 yards ahead of the American line, with no communication, no support. The German artillery could resume at any moment. German infantry might counterattack. His position was completely exposed. He stayed in the ditch for 3 hours. Connor remained in the 18-inch depression, watching the German positions, ready to run back if they attacked again. But the attack didn't come. The German 19th Army had committed everything to this assault. 6 Tigers, 600 infantry. They'd lost half their force in 10 minutes. They weren't coming back. At 10:30, American soldiers from 3rd Battalion advanced through the snow. They found Connor still in the ditch, covered in dirt and frost, his uniform torn by shrapnel, his hands frozen to the telephone handset. They had to pry his fingers off the phone. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ware, walked the battlefield after the German retreat. He counted 50 German dead within 100 yards of Connor's position. 3 disabled Tigers. The German attack had been annihilated. Ware found Connor sitting in the command post, drinking coffee, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the cup. "You called fire on your own position," Ware said. Connor nodded. "It was the only way to stop them. You could have died." Connor looked at him. So could everyone else. Ware wrote the recommendation for the Medal of Honor that night. The citation detailed Connor's actions, volunteering to run through artillery fire, directing fire from an exposed position for 3 hours, calling artillery on himself to stop the German advance. The paperwork went up through 7th Infantry Regiment to 3rd Infantry Division, to 6th Corps, to 7th Army. At each level, officers endorsed the recommendation. Connor's actions met every criterion for the nation's highest military decoration. But the process was slow. The war was still being fought. Awards took months to process. By the time the paperwork reached the Department of the Army in Washington, Connor was already on a ship home. The Army decided to award the Distinguished Service Cross instead. Second highest decoration, faster processing, could be presented before Connor left Europe. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. Patch was the commander of 7th Army. He had come to 3rd Battalion specifically to present the award. The citation read, "Extraordinary heroism during the German counterattack on January 24th. It detailed Connor's advance under fire, his 3 hours directing artillery from an exposed position, his decision to call fire on his own position when the Germans closed to within yards." Connor accepted the medal, put it in his duffel bag with the others, said nothing. On March 15th, Connor left France. He sailed from Le Havre on a transport ship, arrived in New York 3 weeks later. He was honorably discharged on June 22, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 8th. Connor was already home, already trying to forget. Albany, Kentucky held a parade for him in May. The town honored their returning soldier. Alvin York spoke at the ceremony. York was the most famous Medal of Honor recipient from World War I. He had come from Pall Mall, Tennessee, 50 miles from Albany. York understood what Connor had done, understood the weight of it. Connor met a woman at the parade, Pauline Wells. She was 20 years old. She had heard the stories about Connor's service, had heard the medal citations read aloud during the ceremony. She could not believe the stories. Could not believe that the quiet 5'6" farmer standing in front of her had done what the officers described. Connor did not talk about the war. When people asked, he said he had left those memories across the Atlantic Ocean. He would not bring them home. He married Pauline on July the 9th, 1945. They lived on Indian Creek, several miles north of Albany, a farm with no electricity, no running water. They worked the land with mules and horses. Tobacco, corn, the same crops Connor's family had grown for generations. In 1950, the government bought their property. Lake Cumberland was being created. The reservoir would flood their farm. They moved to the Roland community in southeastern Clinton County. Started again. New land, new crops, same life. Connor became president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau, held the position for 17 years. He helped other farmers, advised them on crop rotation, on soil conservation, on dealing with agricultural bureaucracy. He was active in veterans organizations. Paralyzed Veterans of America, Disabled American Veterans. He traveled to nearby counties, helping veterans file claims for benefits. He never talked about January 24, 1945. Pauline asked him once early in their marriage what had happened in France. What had he done to earn all those medals? Connor looked at her, said he had done what needed to be done. That was all there was to it. He would not elaborate. The medals stayed in a cardboard box inside a duffel bag in the back of the living room closet. Pauline knew they were there. She had seen them once. The Distinguished Service Cross, 4 silver stars, Bronze Star, Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre. But Connor never displayed them, never mentioned them, never wore them. 53 years passed. In 1996, a veteran named Richard Chilton wrote to the Connor home. Chilton was researching his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts. Roberts had been killed at Anzio in January 1944. Chilton had learned that Roberts served with Connor. He wanted to know if Connor remembered anything about his uncle's final days. Connor invited Chilton to visit. They sat in the living room. Connor was 77 years old, diabetic, kidney failure. He had maybe 2 years left. Connor told Chilton about Anzio, about Roberts. Connor had carried Roberts to a medical aid station after Roberts was hit, had stayed with him until he died. As Connor spoke, he began to cry. 52 years later, and the memory still broke him. Pauline suggested Chilton look through Connor's military records. Maybe there would be information about Roberts. She brought out the duffel bag, the cardboard box. Chilton opened it, saw the medals, read the citations. His hands started shaking. He looked at Connor, then at Pauline, said one sentence. This man should have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Chilton began the process immediately. Filed paperwork with the Army Board for correction of military records, gathered eyewitness statements from men who had served with Connor, built a case for upgrading the Distinguished Service Cross. The board rejected the application in 1997, rejected an appeal in 2000. Connor died November 5, 1998. He was 79 years old. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany, Kentucky. The Distinguished Service Cross went with him. But Pauline did not stop. She collected more eyewitness accounts, found 3 soldiers who had been in the foxholes on January 24th, who had watched Connor in that ditch for 3 hours, who had seen what he did. She resubmitted the case in 2008. Nothing happened. Historians supported the upgrade. Authors, lawmakers. Stephen Ambrose wrote about Connor in 2000, called his actions far above and beyond the call of duty. The Rhode Island Senate passed a resolution in 2005 calling for the Medal of Honor. 7 retired generals endorsed the application. Still, nothing. In 2014, Pauline sued the Army in federal court. A judge ruled she had waited too long. She appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court. The case went to mediation. During the proceedings, the government attorney broke down crying. Her father had served in 3rd Battalion, had been wounded January 25th, one day after Connor's action. She said Connor might have saved her father's life. The Army Board finally recommended the upgrade in 2015. Congress passed legislation waiving the time limit. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced the award. On June 26, 2018, President Trump presented the Medal of Honor to Pauline Connor in the East Room. She was 89 years old. It had been 22 years since Chilton opened that cardboard box. 20 years since Connor died. The citation was read aloud. First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Connor distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. Volunteered to run 400 yards through enemy fire. Directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position. Called fire on his own position. Killed 50 Germans, stopped 6 Tiger tanks, saved his battalion. Pauline held the medal. The medal her husband had never sought, had never mentioned, had left in a box for 50 years because he thought talking about it would be bragging. The second most decorated soldier of World War II after Audie Murphy. And almost no one knew his name. Connor's story reveals something essential about a generation that history has mostly forgotten. These men did not seek glory. They did what needed doing, then went home and built lives. The medals stayed in boxes. The stories stayed unspoken. Connor worked tobacco fields for 40 years after the war, helped neighbors, raised a family, lived quietly in the same county where he'd been born. When veterans asked about his service, he changed the subject. The only time he ever spoke about the war was when he could help another veteran. Then, he would share what he remembered, but never about himself, always about the others, the men who didn't make it home. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Ware, Connor's battalion commander on January 24, 1945, survived the war. He remained in the Army, eventually rising to Major General. In 1968, he commanded the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam. On September 13, 1968, Ware's helicopter was shot down near Loc Ninh. All aboard were killed. Ware was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In his personal effects, they found a letter he'd written but never mailed. It was addressed to the Army Board for Correction of Military Records. The letter recommended Connor for the Medal of Honor, detailed the events of January 24, 1945, explained that Connor deserved the nation's highest decoration. Ware had never stopped fighting for Connor's recognition. The men who served in 3rd Battalion on January 24th never forgot what happened. Most went home after the war and built civilian lives, but when they gathered at reunions, they told the story. The intelligence officer who ran through artillery fire, who called shells down on himself, who saved the battalion. 3 of them gave sworn statements in 2008 supporting Pauline's application. They were in their 80s by then, but they remembered every detail. The German Tigers advancing, the American positions about to be overrun, Connor in that ditch with shells exploding around him. One veteran, Staff Sergeant James Campbell, wrote, "I was in a foxhole 50 yards from Lieutenant Connor's position. I watched him for 3 hours. I watched him call artillery on Germans who were so close I could have thrown a rock and hit them. When he called fire on his own position, I thought he was committing suicide. I have never seen courage like that. Not before, not since." The Colmar Pocket Offensive ended on February 9, 1945. The French First Army broke through the German lines. The 19th Army retreated across the Rhine. The last German forces left French soil. 3rd Battalion had held. The German counterattack on January 24th was their final attempt to break the American positions. Connor's actions stopped that attack. How many American lives did he save? The battalion had 800 men. If the Tigers had broken through, casualties would have been catastrophic. Conservative estimates suggest Connor's actions saved at least 300 American soldiers that day, but the number is probably higher. If 3rd Battalion had been overrun, the German attack would have rolled through other positions. The entire American line might have collapsed. Connor never calculated the numbers, never thought about how many lives his decision saved. When asked years later what went through his mind in that ditch, he said, "I was just trying to do my job." His job was intelligence officer, maps and reports. He wasn't supposed to be in a ditch calling artillery on himself. But Connor had never done what he was supposed to do. He'd done what needed doing. The Medal of Honor citation hangs in the Pentagon today. Connor's photograph is displayed at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia. His name is engraved on the Medal of Honor Memorial in Indianapolis. But the recognition came too late for Connor to see it. He died never knowing that his country would finally acknowledge what he'd done, died thinking the Distinguished Service Cross was sufficient, died believing that talking about his actions would be inappropriate. That was the difference between Connor's generation and later ones. They didn't seek recognition, didn't demand acknowledgement. They did their duty, came home, moved on. The medals stayed in boxes because the actions they represented weren't about medals. They were about the men in the foxholes, the soldiers who would have died if Connor hadn't made that run, who would have been killed if he hadn't called fire on his position. Connor saved them. That was enough for him. Pauline Connor died in 2020 at age 96. She spent her final years traveling to schools and veterans organizations, telling her husband's story. The story he'd never told himself. She wanted people to know. Wanted them to understand what men like Garlin had done. Wanted them to remember. She's buried next to Connor in Memorial Hill Cemetery. The Medal of Honor is engraved on the shared headstone. Clinton County, Kentucky honors Connor every Memorial Day. The local VFW post is named after him. The high school history classes study his actions. The tobacco farmers in the area remember the quiet man who helped them with their crops, who never mentioned the war, who kept his medals in a box for 50 years. In France, the battlefield where Connor made his stand is unmarked. The forest has grown back, the ditches have filled in. Nothing remains to show where 600 Germans and 6 Tigers tried to break through American lines. But the soldiers who were there remember. Their children remember. Their grandchildren remember. Stories like Connor's force us to reconsider what heroism looks like. It's not always glory, not always recognition. Sometimes it's a 5'6" tobacco farmer lying in a frozen ditch with shells exploding overhead, doing what needs to be done because no one else can do it. Sometimes it's spending 50 years not talking about it, because the men who didn't make it home deserve more honor than the ones who did. Sometimes it's a wife who fights for 20 years to get her husband the recognition he deserved, never stops, never gives up, finally succeeds 2 decades after he's gone. Garlin Murl Connor ran 400 yards through artillery fire, carrying a telephone and a spool of wire. He climbed into a ditch 30 yards ahead of the American line with 600 German soldiers and 6 Tiger tanks advancing toward him. He directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position that provided no protection. And when the Germans got so close that saving his battalion meant killing himself, he gave the order that has echoed through military history for 80 years. Fire on my position. He survived by luck, by will, by 18 inches of frozen earth. He saved his battalion by courage, by sacrifice, by refusing to let the men in those foxholes die. And he never talked about it, because talking about it felt like bragging, because the men who didn't make it home deserved more honor. Because doing your duty doesn't require recognition. That was Garlin Murl Connor, 5'6", 120 pounds, a tobacco farmer from Kentucky who never finished high school, the second most decorated soldier of World War II. And for 73 years, almost no one knew his name.